press the bell icon on the YouTube app to never miss a video from News Laundry.
Hello and welcome. I'm Biraj Swain and this is News Laundry Interviews as part of Hashtag Childhood Matters series. We are bringing this to you from Johannesburg, South Africa. We would have loved to record it in front of a South African iconic monument, but mobile journalism and all that, so we're doing it in a room. We are honored to have Mark Haywood with us today. He is co-founder of the Treatment Action Campaign and Section 27. And why is it a particularly relevant time to talk to Mark Haywood? That's what we're going to be exploring together. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege for me to be able to talk to you. My name is Mark Haywood. 20 years ago this year, we founded the Treatment Action Campaign, myself and somebody called Zaki Ahmad. So we've had 20 years of activism, 20 years of fighting for people's lives, 20 years of fighting against drug companies, 20 years of fighting for a government to deliver on a constitutional promise of the right to health. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So Mark, I think this is a particularly pertinent time to have this, to talk to you. You've been all over the news for taking the government of South Africa to court on the treatment of mental health patients. It actually resonates absolutely with India because a few years ago in the southern Indian state of Tamil Nadu, we had mental health patients chained to their beds. There was a fire that broke out, the staff escaped and the mental health patients died. Tell us a little more about why have you taken to court the government?
I think the first thing I'd say is that this shows that the issues that face poor people are the same across the world, whether you're in India, whether you're in South Africa.
And the state apathy and state
apathy, and then particularly again the vulnerability of the most marginalized people. In South Africa, mental health or mental illness is not diagnosed in the vast majority of poor people. For those people who do suffer very severe mental illnesses, there is almost no care, no doctors, very few facilities. And in this instance, there was a facility which was run by a private health company, but paid for by the government. But 2 or 3 years ago, the government decided that it was too expensive, or at least this is what they said, to continue to provide healthcare to these patients. So they took a decision to close the facility down. We tried to stop them from closing it. We worked with the families, we worked with psychiatric doctors, psychiatric nurses, we marched, we demonstrated, we tried to use the courts, but they went ahead and they closed it down. Within 6 months of closing that facility down, 143 mental health care patients had died. They died in the most shocking and horrendous circumstances. Some of them froze to death because they were put into NGOs where there was no care, where there was no eating. Some of them starved to death. Others died of their illnesses because they left the hospital with no medical records and without the right medicines.
There was no medical history.
There was no medical history. I mean, you talk about, in Tamil Nadu, people being chained up in the fire. In this instance, when people left the hospital, they were put in trucks.
Like cattle.
Like cattle. They were put in the back of trucks and just sent to all of these NGOs which had been set up, and we think they had been set up by the government with corrupt purposes.
So these were fraud on-paper NGOs?
These were on-paper NGOs. There was an element of fraud, and the people went in. And at some of these NGOs, there was one NGO where 38 people died.
But don't you have some sort of safeguards and standards before patients are handed over to NGOs?
But see, that's the point. The law, every standard was broken, every policy was broken,
right.
And it proves the point. And the point here is that where you have effective social justice organizations like the Treatment Action Campaign, which campaigns mainly for people who live with HIV, then you have citizen oversight. People are watching. You can stop this thing from happening. But because mental health is an issue that's so marginalized, people are so vulnerable, people with mental illnesses rarely will be able to speak out for themselves.
Right.
There was no such organization. We tried, as Section 27, but we are 40 people. You know, we're not a movement like the Treatment Action Campaign, which has thousands of volunteers in all parts of the country.
So for our viewers, why this particular issue is important is because Mark has actually taken his time out in this particular week as we are speaking to you in Johannesburg. There's testimony and court trial going on, and there are ministers, NGOs, and Mark's organization, everybody's giving testimony. In fact, I saw the reportage on South Africa Broadcasting Corporation channel early in the morning as part of research to speak to Mark. So let's dial back a bit, Mark. Tell us more about how Treatment Action Campaign started and what is the India connection?
Well, we started the Treatment Action Campaign in 1998. In 1998, South Africa was still in the early days, transitioning. We were 4 years into our democracy. We got democracy in 1994. The whole country was, changing from a colonial state based upon racism to a democratic state based upon equality. But tragically, at much the same time, the AIDS epidemic began to take hold in South Africa. And by 1998, in global terms, people with HIV who lived in the United States or who lived in Europe were beginning to regain life because there were new medicines and they were able to access those medicines. But in developing countries like South Africa or other parts of Southern Africa and India, those medicines were unaffordable. The pharmaceutical companies were making massive profits out of those medicines. And because
the antiretrovirals.
The antiretroviral medicines. And because poor people couldn't afford it and because the government couldn't afford to purchase those medicines, people were dying. Now, in our country...
Do you want to name and shame some of the pharma majors?
Well, the companies like Pfizer, companies like Boehringer Ingelheim, companies like GlaxoSmithKline, they were all at the outset involved, complicit, making huge profits at the expense of people's lives. So we recognized that if we were going to defeat this epidemic, if we were going to stop the dying, we had to form a movement. And that movement had to be made up primarily of poor people. Primarily in South Africa, it also had to reflect the demographic of the epidemic. The demographic of the epidemic is of women and black people, because HIV...
Disproportionately. It's like the tuberculosis in India.
Exactly. It's like any disease anywhere in the world. These are diseases of the poor. So when we started with interrupting, when HIV started, or the public discourse started, it was considered a foreigners and rich people's disease in India. That's the same here. Here it was migrant workers to begin with. First cases of HIV apartheid was still in South Africa, so they said it's a black people's disease, it's a migrant workers, it's a gay person's disease, it's a sex worker's disease. It's everybody else's disease. It's not our disease. But when we started, we were 10 people, literally. It was myself, it was Zaki Ahmad, who you probably heard of, who lives with HIV, still lives with HIV today. And we set out to build this movement. We set out to build a movement that would be able to take on the global pharmaceutical companies and also to take on our own government, because tragically our own government had fallen into a trap. The president then was somebody called Thabo Mbeki, and he was fooled into believing that HIV didn't cause AIDS, and in fact that antiretroviral medicines killed people rather than cured people. So from the very beginning, we had to build a movement that had to fight on two fronts: fighting our government, fighting the pharmaceutical companies, and all of this going on at a time when South Africa was reaping the first fruits of freedom. You ask about the Indian connection. Well,
we are considered the pharmaceutical for the third world developing countries.
Exactly.
Especially Brazil and South Africa, for our viewers, are India's credited Indian pharma majors like Cipla. And Cipla is not paying us, full disclosure. But it has a role in antiretroviral provisioning in South Africa and Brazil, and they are credited for containing the HIV epidemic in these two major southern countries, and also to take on the might of the GlaxoSmithKline and the Pfizer of the world. But how did it come about?
Well,
how did you guys engineer it?
Let me say this. Before we started the treatment action campaign, some of us had already worked for 5 years on HIV and on human rights issues. And through that work, we had come to know some of the Indian activists. We got to know, in particular, Anand Grover from an organization called the Lawyers Collective.
And Anand Grover was also the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health.
Yeah, one of the first activists that we got to know was Anand Grover from India. He, at the time, was running an organization called Lawyers Collective, and Lawyers Collective was doing work in India on discrimination against people with HIV, but Lawyers Collective was also leading the way in urging the Indian government to introduce patent laws that respected the right to health and that limited the powers to profiteer of pharmaceutical companies. And it was, if you like, through the progressive approach of the Indian government that we were able to look at India, and we looked at India and we could see that the same drugs that were far too expensive for people in South Africa and were causing, where people were dying, in India you could get those medicines, and in Thailand you could get those medicines sometimes for 1% of the price that we were paying in South Africa. So we began to study the Indian patent system, but we also began to build bridges with lawyers and activists in India, and also we began to devise common strategies. HIV is a global health issue. Health is a global human rights issue. Intellectual property...
And it's a public good.
And it's a public good. Intellectual property, particularly since 1995, the protection of intellectual properties was one of the hallmarks of new neoliberalism.
Yeah.
So, you had to fight this thing not just alone in South Africa, you had to fight it in South Africa, in India, in Thailand, in Australia, in the United States. So that was one of the interesting things about the HIV movement. It became the first global human rights movement of the 21st century. And when it was strong, it was a highly effective and a highly powerful movement. Unfortunately, it's lost a lot of its power in the last, I would say, in the last 5 or 6 years. But it really cut a path, I think, for human rights activism, and it taught us a lot.
So are you aware, we've had some latest developments on not just the there is something called as the National Pharmaceutical Pricing Authority, which is looking into the price list, essential medicine. There are new legislations coming on why doctors need to be just writing the generic name and not the brand name. But there is also a pushback from the same pharmaceuticals who were third world's pharmacy. Now they are also, I think, probably going into the trajectory of greed and profiteering.
That's the problem, isn't it? I mean, so many of these generic companies, including, sadly, companies like Cipla, when it was convenient. But at the end of the day, many of them have a commercial motive. Many of them have a profit motive. So even though they say, no, we do this because we respect the rights, they do that for a certain amount of time. But people like me, people like you, activists, have to make sure that we watch these companies all of the time, so that where they are private companies, we have to try to make them service a public need at the same time as making profit.
So Thomas Pogge of the University of Yale, a renowned ethicist and ethics professor, has been making a case for making vaccination research the ultimate public good, and he wants a global fund to be set up for vaccination research. You have thoughts on that?
I've heard about this proposal.
Because we have been duped into this pneumococcal vaccine, where I think it's costing like 5 times than what we already had, which was WHO registered also, which is why Government of India is telling that it will roll it out as long as there is co-financing available. The moment the co-financing goes, they're going back to the cheaper, equally effective drug. But thoughts on vaccination research, and should it be globally financed from a public
I think it should. Look,
fund?
we need good, huge amounts of global finance into disease and into medicine development. The situation in the world is that the vast amount of the world's disease falls in developing countries and in poor countries. But most of the research into drugs is for drugs that are only available in developed countries, in rich countries. And, we are in a new era of global health. We're seeing the rise of non-communicable diseases on a much larger scale.
I think
cancer, diabetes, etc. In South Africa we are seeing alarming levels of cancer. But cancer is just like HIV was 15 years ago. If you're poor and you get cancer, if you get cervical cancer, if you get breast cancer, if you get colon cancer, all sorts of cancers, you will probably die.
So in India, we just came out with the disease burden report, and from 1991 to 2016, in 25 years, the death rate from communicable diseases was 61% in 91. Yeah. Now it is 55% from non-communicable diseases. But the number one killer is actually COPD, the pulmonary, obstructive pulmonary disorder. Yeah. But cancer also rates pretty high in the list. So yes, I think access to the non-communicable diseases drugs, since it is a lifestyle management issue, and also access to cancer drugs is going to be an issue. Are you aware of the Gilvec case in Chennai court?
We've heard a little bit about it, yeah.
So for our viewers, Medicines Sans Frontiers and a really brilliant patents lawyer, intellectual property lawyer and law professor, Shamnath Bashir, took Gilvec 500 of Pfizer to court in Madras High Court, and they lost it, and Madras High Court gave a brilliant judgment, not actually on the progressive access, of course on the progressive access, and that people should not be victimized because they are suffering from cancer, but they also called out the bluff of Pfizer, saying Gilvec 500 is actually not a development over the previous drug, but it is not an innovation, it has no additional potency, and hence there is no reason to apply for a fresh patent and just do profiteering and market access. And Shamnath Bashir was the amicus curiae, the advisor to the court of Madras High Court, to call out the bluff on Pfizer's Gilvec 500. So I'm sure that is something that South African activists
no, it is, and
inspiration from.
We use the courts a lot in South Africa. We're fortunate. We probably have one of the most pro-poor constitutions of any country in the world.
You're called the democracy of hope.
We call the democracy of hope. So
we are the largest democracy, and you are the most hopeful democracy.
Well, we've got some serious problems here, but the point is that people in this country have a lot of power. That the poor have a lot of power in terms of the law and the terms of the constitution, if that power is organized. And that's why we need to study judgments that come out of countries like India, and then take the precedent that is set in those judgments and take cases up in our South African courts, because in South Africa, access to healthcare services is a part of our Bill of Rights. Access to basic nutrition, access to sufficient food is all a part of our rights. But as with so much in law, law is a piece of paper. It only works for the poor when the poor start to mobilize and to make demands around the law.
So that has actually been the most inspiring part of Treatment Action Campaign. How you never allowed health. For you, health was too important to be left to the doctors, to the medical professionals. You made health a public agenda, a street agenda, a main street agenda, and how you actually made it a completely... you looked at the political economy and the social determinants and not just the clinics and all of that. We had the privilege to also talk to Anton Harbour, the granddaddy of journalism of your country. And Anton pointed out that your health system was actually designed for 4 million white South Africans. Now you have 55 million people. Unfortunately, your system has not stretched. So while you have super speciality, super fine, almost like hotels, corporate hospitals, some of them we also have in India, your public health system has not exactly expanded to cater to 55 million people. So how are you dealing with that? What is your advocacy and activism around
Well, look, the first thing to say is that it has expanded, and we have to give our government credit for that.
What is your budget allocation?
Well, the budget allocation to health, the public budget allocation, I don't know how this translates, is about 250 billion rand a year.
And what is the percentage of your GDP?
It is about, look, the combined percentage of private and public health is over 8%, which is quite a lot. But when you look at public alone, it's very low. It's only about 4%.
That still is much more for our
Than
viewers.
India, yes, yes.
For our viewers, to put these things in perspective, ours is 1.2%, and Government of India has only committed to make it 2.5% by 2020 or 2022. And activists have been crying hoarse to at least make it 3%, and the WHO benchmark is 5% of the GDP. So we are still nowhere near Southern African allocation.
And I think that, whilst you will hear me make many complaints and many protests about our public healthcare system, I think from what I know of the Indian public healthcare system, the lack of medicines regulation, I mean, we've been talking about the progressive legal framework for the manufacture of generic medicines, but when it comes to a quality framework for medicines for the ordinary person on the street in India, people are able to buy medicines which are not really medicines, which claim properties that they don't have, which are sometimes dangerous. So, one of our challenges in South Africa is to prevent a slide in public health to the levels of India or to the levels of other countries in Africa. So, but having said that, I will tell you that...
So India's current public health system is actually a red herring for you guys.
Yes, yes.
You would not want to go there.
We would not want to go there. In a sense, we would want activists in India to look at our jurisprudence on the right to health and to look at our movements on the right to health and to take courage and inspiration from that. But, having said that...
Well, your country actually made Gandhi Mahatma, so we would not be surprised if
Well, I hope so.
Your country's activists and jurisprudence have the cockiness to ask us to learn from you.
I hope so. Well, we all need to learn from each other wherever we have strengths. Mm-hmm. But the point is that health is a marker of inequality. So Absolutely. You talked about the private healthcare system. South Africa spends as much money on its private healthcare system as it does on its public healthcare system. But the private healthcare system serves 16% of the population. The rest of the population, the other 84%, is dependent on public healthcare. But each spends the same amount of money. And so...
But in India, in case of India, the problem is almost 67% of rural India and more than 75% of urban India is going to private healthcare system.
Yeah, well that's the thing. But you see, health is of such a nature that, if you're poor, bad health, can kill you. Yeah. So you will take all your money, all your savings, all your relative savings, and you will try and find a way to get into the private healthcare system. And that's what feeds the private healthcare system. That's why you need a strong public healthcare system, because that then does away with the need for people to lose all of their income, all of their savings, everything, and go into private healthcare. And this is one of the things that we have to fight for.
So how are you making your government sort of build a system which is sort of catering to the 55 million?
Well, our government has a good policy of something called national health insurance. Mm-hmm. So they are trying at the moment to create a unitary healthcare system where it doesn't matter what class, what colour, what ethnic group you are, you have access to the public and the private healthcare system. So if there's a private hospital across the road, and this is a very rich area, part of Johannesburg, if you are poor...
You can tell our viewers...
Yeah, I can tell you, you're sitting in the most bourgeois, almost the richest square mile of Africa.
Well, News Laundry is not paying for it. This is International Centre for Journalists, and News Laundry had no role for me. I mean, if Abhinandan had his way, I would probably be living in a student's hostel to do this interview, but International Centre for Journalists has put me here.
And I'm not criticising you, but the point is that, here we are, 2 or 3 miles away, you have, people who are living in shacks. It's like India, but we hide our poverty better than you do in India. Yeah. I think from my times I've been to India, you see it all around you on the streets.
So how do you hide it? You put this big corrugated
we keep people, and we keep people, not we, but I'm saying we, but people are kept on the edges
the urban planners,
of the urban planners. South Africa still has not really got beyond the spatial residential planning. that existed under apartheid. Under apartheid, white people lived in areas like this.
So you have segregated habitation.
We still have, not by law, but class and cost operates to keep black people mostly living in black people's areas, white people with a sprinkling of black people here and there who've managed to get money or get into business in areas like this. So, you know, we've got a huge amount still to overcome.
So it's probably going to take another 10, 15 or 50 years for a resident from Soweto to come to Horton. Or maybe you can actually de-class Horton.
Yeah, well...
gentrify Soweto and de-class Horton.
Well, you know, if our government was truly working for the poor, then that's the sort of thing that it ought to be doing. Again, to go back to our constitution is very unusual because it commits our country to social justice. It expressly commits our country to equality. It expressly says that government must always act in the interests of the people, that its policies must be development-oriented, they must be pro-poor. But of course, that only happens when people, as we have done through the Treatment Action Campaign or Section 27, put enough pressure on the government to make sure that it fulfills its obligations.
Right. So, tell us a little more about, since this is a Child Health Fellowship, Child Development Fellowship that I have, one of the things that we've been grappling with is how much of child development work is located in the household. There's almost a free pass on state accountability. So much of it is about behavior change, and at certain iconic public health activists, including yourself, have always screamed about the more you locate good health or as an outcome of just good behavior, you're completely giving a free pass to the state accountability, the system structures, this political economy issues and all that. You have any thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I agree with you. The second thing that I would say is that, you know, there are deep structural reasons that impact on child health because there's not enough of a countervailing force. You know, for me, everything is about it's contest. It's contest between the interests of citizens and the poor, the majority of our countries, and the interests of business. And where you have governments that are primarily influenced by business, then they work within paradigms and models such as the model that you have just said. So, you know, child health is a behavioral thing, it's the problem of the mother, it's the problem of the lack of education, etc., etc. It's not the system problem. So, and again, it goes back to inequality. You know, in this country, we're a rich country.
The problem of not having paid maternity benefits, not having maternity entitlement, household food insecurity, shanties and all of that.
Exactly, and those are the driving factors. And another major driving factor, I mean, in South Africa and probably India as well, to be young and poor and black is to live a nightmare for the vast majority of people who fall into that category. You know, in my work at Section 27, we do a lot of work on the right to basic education. And just to give, you know, your viewers, listeners, a shocking example, the other court case I'm involved in at the moment concerns a small child who was 5 years old, who went to school, and the schools don't have proper toilets. They just have pits dug in the ground. Pit latrines, you know what a pit... And this little boy went to the toilet at break time, and the toilet collapsed because it was just corrugated iron, and he fell, and he drowned.
In the shit.
In the shit.
Human feces.
In the human feces at the bottom of the toilet. A 5-year-old.
And died.
And died. Died 4 years ago. Exactly 4 years ago. Yeah. And we are now fighting. We're in the middle of a court case to claim damages for his parents, but more important, we're trying to get the court to give an order instructing the government to fix sanitation in public schools, because we know in that one province alone, which is called Limpopo, 50,000 kids, young kids, go to schools where there are not proper toilets. It may be pit toilets, which are dangerous. It may be toilets that have no doors, where there's no privacy. You know, for young girls, and again, this is a health issue, you know, during time of menstruation, they don't go to school. because there's no privacy, there's nowhere to change, there's nowhere to wash. So all of these issues...
So that's again something resonates with India, because right now our Prime Minister's favorite flagship campaign is the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, the total sanitation campaign, so Swachh Bharat mission. And money is being pumped. Every single purchase we make, we pay 0.5% tax, which goes to that. But it is not addressing discrimination, issue of caste, issue of manual scavenging, working and living conditions of sanitation workers. So some of the sanitation workers themselves are calling out the limitations, that it is a toilet construction spree without even focusing on access to water, potable water within the toilets.
Yeah.
So
no, but there you go. You see, you know, you need toilets.
I'm getting worried that South Africa has too much to learn as no-goes.
No, we
from
do.
India.
No, we do.
Not to go.
You know, but as I'm having this conversation with you, I'm just thinking, I wish I had more conversations like this, because we learn a lot
Where
from
not
each
to
other.
go.
Where not to go, and where to go.
Yeah. So the other thing I heard from, again, the granddaddy of journalism of your country, Anton, is that as long as Treatment Action Campaign was political, there was a lot of journalism pressure, there was a lot of journalism interest, and it was almost like media and Treatment Action Campaign working together to make right to health, right to treatment, access to health a fundamental human right. But as long after you started sitting with the government in drafting the service, operationalizing that right, what does that right mean on ground, in hospitals, in budget allocations, the journalism has waned on it. Do you feel the same? And
he's right and he's wrong.
And a connected question is, what are your expectations? What is your assessment of the state of health journalism in your country and globally, and what are your expectations?
So let me deal with the last thing first. There are a handful of good health journalists. Unfortunately, and we have a population of 55 million people, there are probably 5 good health journalists in the whole country, which is shocking. And that means that health issues do not get properly analysed. The dots that you were talking about as to what is really the causes of ill health, developmental issues, do not get examined or looked at. They don't enter into the public consciousness. So we need much, much better and bigger and more accessible health journalism. That's the first point. And it's true globally, because health is becoming a globalized issue, and it is becoming a global security threat, particularly to poor people, and it's becoming a driver of greater and greater inequalities. And health is more and more overlapping with other civilizational, social issues. So climate change.
And it's the ultimate market frontier also.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, but something like climate change has major health implications. In southern Africa it means, and probably in parts of India as well, the return of mosquito infestation into areas where previously there was no mosquitoes.
Do you have a malaria issue?
We don't have a malaria issue in most parts of South Africa, but in northern South Africa and in eastern South Africa, the poorer parts of South Africa up on the border of Zimbabwe, Mozambique, those are areas which are malarial areas, and we're seeing increasing incidence of malaria. So anyway, to summarize, so we need better, there is good journalism, we need more of it, we need better journalism. To come to your question about the Treatment Action Campaign
and the media interest.
Anton is not actually right. You see, what happened was this. When the Treatment Action Campaign was fighting the president of our country, because the president of the country was refusing to provide antiretroviral treatment through the public health system, the media saw it as a political fight, a political issue, and there was a lot of interest in it. And the Treatment Action Campaign took advantage of that media interest, and we worked very effectively and well with journalists. We won that struggle. In 2007, for the first time, the government adopted a policy that said it will ensure universal access to antiretroviral treatment. now there are 4 million people in this country who every day receive antiretrovirals freely through the public health system. So it was a huge victory. But you know, if you're an activist, you can't only protest. Okay? A good activist will protest, and a good activist will keep his or her independence. But a good activist also has to understand the issues, and sometimes a good activist
co-create a progressive system.
Exactly, and sometimes you have to go in to make the system work. So it's true that we did go in to make the system. I mean, I myself, for 5 years, was the leader of the National AIDS Council of South Africa alongside the president of the country. But whilst we went in, we continued to operate independently on the outside. So if journalists were to look at the HIV epidemic in South Africa today, and if they were looking at the TAC, they would see that there are protests taking place every day in villages and in towns and in certain cities. But they would also see that the issue of HIV has not gone away. That, you know, we still have in this country 150,000 deaths a year because of HIV. You know, we have, that means several hundred deaths per day because of HIV. We have a spiraling multi-drug resistant tuberculosis epidemic.
Same in our country also. The MDR-TB.
MDR-TB. There are many threats. And so, you know, I say that, of course, journalists have to be independent, but journalists also have to be activists in a certain way. Activists for the truth. They have to know that with journalism comes a heavy responsibility, because journalism frames the world and it creates people's perceptions and understandings of the world. So if journalists are culpable in closing the window on an issue, then they're culpable. And
so I guess your favorite definition of journalism would be something like comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable?
Yes, to some extent. But I'm not, you know, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that there isn't a role, that, you know, that there is an ethic, there is an independence. But I do believe that journalism, good journalism, has a public purpose. And a public purpose means serving the interests of the majority of the country and reflecting the concerns of the majority of the country, rather than creating a news or a set of issues that is about minority preoccupations.
So News Laundry is actually, we're grateful that you're making this statement, because News Laundry is actually about reclaiming journalism as a public good, reclaiming media as a public good and a public service.
Yeah.
So any last thoughts on, first, solidarity with India and the progressive movements of your country and our country, and also thoughts on both health journalism, what is your wish list, and what you would like to see in the, not just the health beat, but also the discourse around child development?
Well,
that's 3 questions.
Okay, so first of all, on connections and solidarity.
Even your wish list for what kind of negotiations India should be doing at the WTO.
Well, India
must. Pharma.
India must. That's easy. India must stick to its line, which has been to say that health is a human right, and that there are exceptions within the TRIPS agreement that allow human rights to trump strict, tight intellectual property rules. India was one of the few countries in the world that resisted the pressure of the United States and of the European Union, and they should continue to do that. On solidarity, you know, we need solidarity. We need India to show solidarity with us. We should show solidarity with India. I have demonstrated outside the Indian embassy here in support of organizations like the Lawyers Collective that have had their licenses taken or cancelled by Modi because you have a right-wing government that is clamping down on civil society, and we will continue. Which
is also talking about privatizing district hospitals.
Absolutely, absolutely.
In a PPP model.
Yeah, and we need, you know, we need Indian activists to win their struggle, because if you lose, we all lose. So solidarity remains critical. On this issue of health journalism, I think I've said it. I mean, we need quality, informed, intelligent, analytical,
and sustained, not just event-based.
Exactly. Yeah. So don't pick up an issue. You play with the issue for 2 weeks and then you forget the issue. Yeah. Issue is still there. You know, that happens in this country. We have terrible problems with gender-based violence. We have a femicide epidemic. We have an epidemic of rape. The media gets interested for a few weeks and then there's all these stories and then they drop it. But meantime, women are still being murdered. Meantime, women are still being raped. So again, it comes to this issue of what is the public responsibility of a journalist? What is the ethics of a journalist?
And about the child development discourse?
Well, I think the child development discourse is extremely important. In South Africa, I have to say that the child development discourse is extremely undeveloped. Mm-hmm. People don't think about it. There isn't sufficient activism taking place around it, and it's not being
And why is that?
You know, ours is a complicated country at the moment. We're still new as a democracy. You know, we're
still the most hopeful democracy.
We're a hopeful democracy, but we're only 23 years old, 24 years old. So there are still many issues that are playing out as a kind of post-liberation issues, and sometimes those post-liberation issues serve to hide the underlying social questions. So while you have been here, you know, you will have seen that for the last 3 years, our big struggle has been about the capture of our state, in fact, by an Indian family.
The Guptas.
The Guptas.
And I believe it is a shining hour of investigative journalism that
investigative journalism has played an enormously important part in disentangling that and actually disrupting and eventually in destroying that empire.
But you were making a point before we started rolling about how you think the journalism around big corruption, investigative stuff, it's an economic corruption is still a lot more than journalism about everyday public service delivery.
That's right.
Do you want to close on that?
Well, let me close on that. I mean, our journalists in South Africa the last 2-3 years have been marvellous in exposing corruption, in exposing links between corrupt politicians,
crony capitalism,
and every day the newspapers are full of them, and they've been extremely effective in beginning to break this system down. But you know, the consequence of corruption and state capture and crony capitalism is felt in the lives of poor people, and it's felt most in the institutions and public services which are meant to assist poor people. So the health system, or the public education system. And very rarely do journalists look at what is going on there, and they also don't know how to tell those stories. That's the other problem, is that there's a model, there's a paradigm for how to tell a story about corruption. Journalists don't know how to tell a story very easily about a child who dies in a toilet, or about 143 mental health care patients, or the smaller, in inverted commas, stories that take place every day about the suffering of poor people. And it's not just, I'm not just saying tell stories of suffering, I'm saying that contribute to these effects on
the everyday lives of everyday people.
Exactly.
You're an icon of our times, an icon for our times. It's an absolute pleasure and privilege to be talking to you. Thank you so much for taking the time out. For our viewers, Mark has taken time out during the litigation going on the mental health patients, so we could not be, and this absolutely short notice, he still made time for us. To know more about Section 27, we will be giving a link of a very heartwarming article in Daily Maverick about Section 27, the organization he co-founded, to take on the narrative of how journalism is incapable of telling the story of what corruption does to access to health or everyday lives of everyday people. Oxfam has a fantastic short video on what tax evasion does to access to health, and we will be talking about that. We will be giving link to that. This is our offering on #Childhood Matters. The people we would like to acknowledge, and this one is Mandip Tiwana of Civicus, who went out of his way to set up, not only connect me with Mark, but give me reasons why we should be talking to Mark, but also set up this meeting. Skand Vivek Dhar of Hindustan. He's a co-fellow from the International Center for Journalists program, and Amit Bhatt, who's again a co-fellow. We have to acknowledge the International Center for Journalists, Washington, D.C. for my fellowship to let us do this dedicated series. Before I sign off, please support independent media, please support News Laundry so that you can decide what really matters and why childhood matters. This is Biraj Swain signing off.